C'est qui? Qui? C'est Kikina Studio.
Hello everyone, welcome to this new episode of JINS. Like every Thursday, I speak again and again about sexuality and gender in the Arab and or Muslim world. Because, yes, in this world, we never talk about sex. And yet, at the same time, we talk about it all the time. Generally speaking, we always adopt a very culturalist vision of sexuality for Arab and or Muslim people by comparing them with the liberated mores of the West. But if there is one thing that is universal, it is sexuality. How to explain then that it conditions all the taboos and the unspoken? Sex is already a big word. Jins means sex in Arabic. So just by saying it, some people will already say that I have gone too far. Are Arabs prudes? Everything in history tends to show the contrary. Don't they also have the right to pleasure? Well, speaking of pleasure, it is my great pleasure today to welcome an international personality, Shereen EL FEKI. She's a writer, a journalist, half Egyptian and half Welsh. Shereen was brought up in Canada. She started her professional life in medical science with a PhD in immunology from the University of Cambridge, and later she worked as a healthcare correspondent at The Economist. She's also a former vice chair of the United Nations Global Commission on HIV and Law, while she has worked in regional media as a presenter with the Jazeera Network. She continues to write on social issues in the Arab world. Her passion lies in projects that aim to better understand and surmount the social challenges facing Arabs, specifically young people. She is most notable for her book, Sex and the Citadel, that she wrote in 2013, which is the biggest survey and study that we can find today on sexuality in the Arab world. Dear Shereen, thank you very much for accepting my invitation.
It's a great pleasure. I'm very glad that the JINS podcast is up and running. That's terrific.
So let's start with a question that sets the scene for your investigation about sexuality in the Arab world. What are the tensions at the heart of sexual culture in Arab societies?
So I would say the central tension, because there are many, but many of them stem from this distinction between appearance and reality. In my experience, having traveled across the region, talking to people about sexuality, what they do, what they don't, and why, over more than a decade, I found that the real issue is not what people are doing necessarily, but it's what they're seen to be doing that is the issue. And that's what greatly concerns people. So as long as you keep it under the table, there seems to be an implicit or social contract, a sort of acceptance. It's when it comes to the surface that problems arise. So I'll give you one illustration of this. A lot of my work, and indeed my job today is focusing on HIV/AIDS in our region, and I was in Morocco researching the book, and I was out with a fantastic NGO that has really been a pioneer in trying to educate, prevent, and support people living with HIV. We were out on the town in Casablanca in the evening, essentially handing out condoms and giving information in order to help empower sex workers to protect themselves. So we went to this bar and we met two students. And they were early 20s. They were hairdressing students, and they were turning tricks for enough cash to buy mobile phones, clothes, all this. So the outreach workers talked to them and said, look, we really think it's important that you should be using condoms when you're doing your work to protect you from HIV. And they said, no, 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 no. We don't need condoms. No, 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 no. We want to get married. So we are virgins. We don't engage in vaginal penetrative sex. So essentially what these young women were saying, because they were specializing in either either anal sex or outer course or oral, is that for the sake of the appearance of virginity and intact hymen, they were exposing themselves to these tremendous risks. So it really brought home this distinction between appearance and reality, and it's not just in intimate life; it's on all other aspects of life across the Arab region. But the problem when you have this distinction is that a lot of stuff can come in the middle, which includes HIV/AIDS, which includes all the issues around sexual violence, for instance. So we really do need to find a way in the region to make appearance and reality come closer together.
You started this work on sexuality in the Arab world a little over 10 years ago, at the dawn of what has been called the Arab Spring. Since then, can we say that there has been a summer or a winter in terms of sexual liberation?
So I think the terminology is a little bit, it needs to be questioned, because sexual liberation, what are we really talking about here? There is often a framing of sexual changes in societies based on the paradigm of the sexual revolution in the West, which, by the way, was not some sort of sudden occurrence. Although we think about it as from the 1960s onwards, really that change in sexual mores, which actually is quite interesting, was not just that people's behaviors or attitudes were changing. It's that they were closing the gap between appearance and reality, that they were more willing to make visible what they were doing in private. But in any case, in the West, that took a considerable period of time. I mean, there was a long period of political, social, and economic change that led to that transformation. Now, I think what's interesting in the Arab region is people often ask, well, will we have a sexual revolution? I don't think that's the right question. I think what we're looking at in the Arab region is more of a sexual evolution. What we're looking at are changes in attitudes and behaviors that are going to be very slow and are going to small steps on a long journey. Because if you want these changes to stick, then you need to not go fast, because we know what fast leads to. We tried political revolution in the Arab Spring, and sort of look where that got us. So if you can't get dramatic change in the political realm, it's going to take much longer in sexuality, because it's much more complex. Sex brings in politics, religion, economics, all the other factors. So I think the important question to be asking is not about sexual liberation per se, but it is about sexual rights. If you look, for example, in the United Nations, in the context of HIV, we have a new global political declaration on HIV/AIDS. And it was very controversial when it was discussed last year at the General Assembly. And a lot of Muslim majority countries, including most of the states from the Arab region, really pushed back on any language that related to sexuality, sexual identity, sexual orientation, comprehensive sexuality education, sexual rights. These are still very controversial politically. What do these mean personally? What sexual rights at their heart are about is your right to a safe and satisfying sexual life free of violence, discrimination, or coercion, right? But how you define safe, satisfying, and pleasurable, by the way, is very specific. It can change. I have met young women across our region who, frankly, are not looking for the freedom to have sex before marriage. They feel, according to their faith, that they would like to wait for marriage. What they would like to have is the right for their bodies to be their own business. That, for example, the family or the community is not surveying their hymen and being very careful of their honor. This is my body and it's my business. I would say that what has changed in the Arab region is the ability to talk, at least in semi-public, semi-private spaces. And by that, I mean in social media. So since the uprisings, we have seen an absolute flourishing of discourse around sexuality on Facebook, on Twitter, and Instagram. I mean, all the platforms, you're seeing conversations happening. And what's interesting about these conversations is that, of course, these conversations are happening in the offline world all the time. People are talking about sex all the time across our region. But it's women largely talking to women and men largely talking to men. In these conversations online, what you're seeing are men and women being able to interact and talk about sex in ways that you simply cannot do in most cases offline because of again, how will I be seen, right? Will I be seen, particularly from women, as a bad woman if I'm asking these questions? Does that mean I'm interested in sex? Does that mean maybe I have some sexual experience? So in general, what I would say that's happened since the Arab Spring is that basically we've taken one step forward on sexuality and half a step back. But I have to say that in our region, that's what we call progress.
There is a criticism that persists, though, especially in the West, that Islam is against sexuality and that religion is the main source of our sexual constraints. So can you explain to us how this is a flawed or even erroneous criticism?
So what I would say is that the problem is not Islam. The problem is us as Muslims, and how political forces have entwined with religion to create interpretations which are very conservative around aspects of sexuality. The long history of Islam, not just in our region, but across the Muslim majority world, is not one of closed-mindedness around sex. Quite the contrary. What's interesting is that in its essence, Islam recognizes that sex is such a powerful force that it needs to be controlled and channeled, or it will cause fitna, it will cause confusion. And one of those channels is marriage. So that is why we have all these exhortations and regulations, as it were, around sexuality within marriage. And that's what I call the Citadel in my book, that the only socially and religiously accepted context for sex is marriage. It's like a citadel. It's like a fortress, and anything outside of that is haram, just not socially acceptable. What I would say in the context of religion, if you go back to, for example, the Prophet, peace be upon him, there is a very pro-sex discourse. I mean, sex is a gift from God, and we are meant to enjoy it. And you can see this reflected in the Hadith and the basic tenets of Islam. This is not an ascetic. We are not ascetics by nature in Islam. So the Prophet, peace be upon him, was once asked by a believer, one of the new Muslims, and how should we go back intimate relations? And he said that any relation with your wife should be preceded by a kiss and by a message. And the believer asked, well, what message is this, O Prophet? And he said, a kiss and sweet words. So again, foreplay, good lovemaking is to be, to be a good Muslim is to be good in bed, frankly. I mean, I'm just going to say this very bluntly. It is within a particular context. And again, that's marriage. But you need to understand that also marriage is quite a flexible concept in Islam. For example, in Shia Islam, they have informal marriages, constructs called zawaj muta, pleasure marriages, which are much more flexible arrangements than, for example, we have in Sunni Islam. Nonetheless, in Sunni Islam, we have other forms of unofficial marriage, which zawaj orfi, for example, Zawaj Misyar, for instance. So what I would say fundamentally is that when it comes to sex and even really tough topics within sexuality, like same-sex relations, for instance, conservatives will tell you that it's black and white. But fundamentally, there are 50 shades of gray when it comes to sex, or most issues to do with intimate life in Islam. And historically, and this is what's very interesting, historically, we in the Arab region, who are now famous for being bottled up about sex, were actually considered to be the masters of sex. If you go back 1,000 years to the Abbasid period, we had these fantastic writings about sex. I mean, everything about sexuality you could imagine. I mean, there is nothing in, Cosmo or you porn or 50 Shades of Grey that they weren't writing about 1,000 years ago in Baghdad. And this long tradition of erotica in Arabic, many of these books were written by the Olam because they saw nothing incompatible with the needs of the flesh and the needs of the faith. And it's not a coincidence that the winding down of this writing on sexuality basically coincides with foreign occupation, colonization by the European powers. And that's when you start to see more reticence seeping in to at least this mirror of sexual discourse, which is the erotica. And then it really picks up speed with the emergence of Islamic fundamentalism in the 1920s with the founding of the Muslim Brotherhood. What's interesting in this history is that when you look back on our history as Arabs and as Muslims, when we are at the peak of our political, economic, and cultural influence, we had no problems talking about sex and writing freely about sex. And as we wound down in our influence in those big picture domains, we also became more bottled up about sex.
So Shereen, you've been working on men and masculinity in the Arab world. Is it fair to talk about a crisis of Arab masculinity? What makes them more vulnerable? Is it the undermining of patriarchy? Is it maybe globalization? Women finally getting their rights? Is it the non-heteronormative sexualities becoming more and more visible?
So all of the above, effectively. What I would say also is that the issues facing Arab men are not unique to the Arab world. In fact, all this conversation we're having, Jamal, about sexuality in the Arab region applies to other parts of the world. There's no Arab exceptionalism here. So when we look at men in the Arab region, it's very, very interesting that if you go back to these books of erotica, they are full of recipes for lotions and potions and techniques for men to really up their sexual game. There is the perception outside of the Arab world that women are repressed, oppressed. And that is in many cases true. But it's very interesting that historically, if you look at this, it's not that women are seen as these weak, submissive sexual beings. In fact, quite the contrary. Even within our holy book, the Quran, and if you look at the Hadith as well, there is really the conceptualization of women's sexuality as being much more powerful than that of men, and therefore it needs to be controlled, right? Because if we don't, then fitna. So in a sense, a lot of this sort of crisis of masculinity or the problems that men are facing is to do that. It's fear, actually. It's fear that the power of women. But I would say that is connected more broadly to the pressures that men are under across the region. Fast forward a couple of years, and basically I was working with a great NGO called Promundo, which is one of the leaders in the global movement to engage men and boys on gender equality, along with UN Women, to do a very big study of more than 15,000 men and women across the region in 7 countries, asking what does it mean to be a man today. But there is this impression of the patriarchy that it's great for all men. Well, it isn't. If you're at the top, if you're the man at the top of the pyramid, or it's actually, life is good. But the problem is for all the men underneath who are subjected to all sorts of economic, political, and social pressures. And one of the things that came out very clearly and is linked to this fear that men experience is that men, and particularly young men in our region, define themselves as what I would call homo economicus. I am a man because I provide for my family, because I have a job, because I put food on the table. But the problem we have in our region, for example, if you're a man in your late 20s, a university graduate in Egypt, and you're struggling to get a job because unemployment rates are very high for young men. So what are you going to do? If you don't get married, you can't really have, in most cases, a regular sexual life. You're not supposed to be having sex outside of marriage. So it feeds into this, and you can't start a family. And if you can't start a family, it's hard to move out of your parents' place. So it's hard to realize all these milestones of masculinity. To look at another group of men who are also under pressure, if we look at the refugees, along with our partners, our research partners in Lebanon, we interviewed Syrian refugee men, and their stories were really heartbreaking because they had gone to Syria where they were, very much patriarchal society. They were the ones who went out, earned money, their wives stayed at home. And then when they went into exile, those roles were reversed. The women could find jobs, they were less controlled by the police, so they went out and earned money, and the men were stuck at home. And one man described it very nicely. He said, back at home in Syria, we were men of steel. But now that we are in exile, we are like tissue. We tear very easily. And the men who are feeling that in their all other aspects of their lives, it's not a surprise that translates into their intimate life. And one of the ways we have seen this, particularly in refugees, is that there has been a spike, even before COVID, with domestic violence. That men become angry and frustrated with their situation and very often take it out in violent forms on their intimate partners. So it all comes together in like a pressure cooker for men in the Arab region. And this is not to excuse bad behaviors, but it is to explain them.
About that, a little trivia. In Egypt, the sexual anxiety begins for many men on their wedding night with the fear of being marhi, soft. Studies conducted throughout the region show that more than 40% of men of a certain age may suffer from some form of erectile dysfunction, ED. There's also the phenomenon of rabt that makes men marbutin. Literally, it means tied down. It's as if men were basically handcuffed, or shall I say, penis cuffed. I want to go back a bit on the injunction for women to be a virgin. So the patriarchy still controls women's bodies, and I have the impression that women themselves sometimes perpetuate this patriarchal order, which exercises what French sociologist Michel Boson called a consented domination. So let's talk about virginity. Why is the hymen of an Arab woman so important?
Patriarchy is not just supported by men, it's supported by women as well. And it's very interesting. I'll go back to the study that I was talking about. When we talked to men and women about, should a woman have a right to work outside the home? Can women be both good leaders and good mothers, for instance? I mean, questions that are probing gendered attitudes. What we found is that when you looked at women's education, women's employment, for instance, sharing duties around the house or decision making, by and large, women were quite open about this. They said, yes, we should have the same rights as men in these domains, with some exceptions. But when we got to issues of sexuality, it was very interesting that the women often, evinced as conservative attitudes as men. Particularly around these issues related to virginity. If a woman is raped, she should marry her assailant, for example. I mean, really hardcore. And it's interesting because, in a sense, why are women buying into the patriarchy? At some level, they do benefit for example, the primacy of sons over daughters, that the sons are princes and the daughters in the family are often, serving the sons. But again, that will have some benefits from the mother's perspective when the son marries, for example, and brings his new wife to the home, for instance. So the idea, I find that women are in our region are hopeless and helpless and are just co-opted by the system. No, actually, in many cases, and not all cases, but in many cases, women are working the patriarchy to their own benefit, and that is why they are supporting it. It is a calculated decision on their part. Now, how this relates back to the hymen is, again, this goes back to the idea of the appearance and reality. You are performing virginity on your wedding night. The woman is expected to bleed on penetration, and then you have the sheet of honor, for example, which is still often used even in what we consider to be quite educated and westernized circles in our region as proof that we as parents, for example, delivered. We did what we were supposed to do by society, and we delivered a virgin bride. But it's also performance on the part of the groom as well, because he's expected to be potent enough, right, to do the job. And so this ramps up the pressure for both men and women. If the only socially accepted context for sexual life is marriage, then you want to be married because you want to fulfill a fundamental aspect of your personal life as a human being. So you want to make sure that you get into the Citadel and you stay in the Citadel. This is the social pressure to conform is very, very high, and the hymen is in a sense a signifier of that. The problem, of course, is for the people who don't fit in the Citadel. So, quite aside from the large number of LGBTQI people who exist across our region, but if you're a young woman, or for example, who has natural desires as a human being for a fulfilling sexual life, what if you don't get married? What if you can't get married? If you look at what's happening now because of the economics in our region, at the average age of marriage, in parts of North Africa, for instance, it's up to early 30s for men and late 20s for women. Now, the Prophet, peace be upon him, urged us, both men and women, to remain virgins before marriage. And when asked, how do you do that? He suggested, perhaps you would like to fast. But the Prophet did not mean we were supposed to fast into our 20s and 30s. The world has moved on, and the realities that we face are not the same as they were at the dawn of our faith. But the attitudes in many cases have not shifted, or the rules have not shifted, because they serve the powers that exist today, whether they're at the high political level or within the community or within the family, to keep the order. Again, it's the symbolism. It's the appearance of virginity. And so I interviewed an Egyptian gynecologist, and he had a fantastic comparison to give me about this distinction between appearance and reality, or what we're doing and what we're saying. Okay, and he said, Yashirin, in our region, sex is the opposite of sport. Football, everybody watches it, everybody talks about it, but hardly anyone plays it. But sex, everyone is doing it, but no one wants to talk about it. And so what is interesting now is that we are having these conversations, as I mentioned earlier, and virginity is part of that. You can now go on various websites and social media platforms where you can now find straight talk in Arabic. And this was a problem before, that we didn't really have a language to talk about these issues because we don't have comprehensive sexuality education in our region. And so now you can find this information about, different types of hymen, why certain hymens don't bleed, kaza. And this is all very helpful, but it's not enough, because we do need to get this message out about, the basic facts about sexuality, so that young people can make informed decisions about their intimate lives. I find it really interesting that in so many countries in our region, we have these very elaborate programs to empower young people to lead us into the future. But at the same time, we don't have sexuality education. So you don't trust young people with the information to lead their personal lives and develop all the aspects that we want to see them exercise in public life, like responsibility and accountability and informed decision making. If you don't trust them to do that in their private lives, how on earth are they going to do that in their public lives? The personal and the public connect. And that is why I'm working with some fantastic activists and other groups on the ground to try to close this gap between appearance and reality.
Virginity sometimes becomes a real family affair, right? Many women have reconstructive surgery on their hymen. In Morocco, hymenoplasty can be performed on the eve of the wedding night, and it costs varying from 2,000 to 4,000 dirhams, which is about $400. The Chinese hymen has also appeared on the shelves of Casablanca, Morocco since 2009. Sold secretly, it is a water-soluble bag worth about $12 that must be inserted into the vagina half an hour before the penetrative sexual act. I also want to thank very quickly all the sex ed accounts in Arabic that are mushrooming today on Instagram. So I would also like us to talk about a very crucial topic, that of FGM, female genital mutilation. We cannot ignore the violence that millions of women are still undergoing today. It is estimated that 200 million women are excised in the world, and that 60,000 excised women currently live in France. In Egypt, Copt Christian little girls are still excised in the same proportions as Muslim girls. 9 out of 10 women in Egypt, Eritrea, Mali, and Sudan have undergone some kind of FGM. So can you tell us more about FGM?
Right. So FGM is, or actually, it's, as it's known across our region, female circumcision, is practiced in certain countries, in certain societies, in the Arab region. It's highly prevalent in Egypt. According to the last study in 2014 national survey, 83% of women in Egypt are circumcised. And we also find it in Sudan, to a certain extent in Yemen and Oman, and also interesting in certain communities in Iraq. It comes back to the Citadel, actually. It's done because mothers and fathers want to ensure that their daughters are marriageable. All right. Again, the Citadel. You want to be protected. Most people want to be inside the Citadel. Okay. In order to get into the Citadel, you need to be a virgin. All right. Okay. And so there's this impression, again, based on very faulty information, that by clipping the clitoris, effectively, you cool a girl's sexual desires. And therefore, she is less likely to have sex before marriage, but also she is less likely to have sexual relations outside of marriage. And therefore, she'll stay married and she'll be in the Citadel. So the challenge here has been how to eradicate this practice. There have been millions and millions of dollars and decades of effort, and I'm going to speak specifically here in Egypt, to try to eliminate FGM. What we are seeing in Egypt now, for instance, that women's attitudes towards FGM have changed. Around about 50% of women in recent surveys say that they would circumcise daughters. And these are young women, all right? These are women in their early 20s. But that's a lot, okay? But on the other hand, it's down from 80, 90% 15 years ago. So clearly the campaigns around FGM are having an impact. But the issue here is that these campaigns have been largely directed towards women. And there wasn't really an appreciation of how engaged men are in this practice. Because, the thought was that this is, women's stuff, right? Women's business. It wasn't just women, like the mothers, the grandmothers, the aunts, et cetera, who are making the decision about whether a girl, usually around the ages of about 9 to 12, would be circumcised. But it was also the men folk in the family as well. But the campaigns to date have not really focused on men and getting the message over to them as to why FGM is just a very bad idea and you shouldn't be doing it. So, things are moving. There is progress, but it's very, very slow. And Egypt was supposed to, or the world, not just Egypt, but where FGM is practiced, we have these things called the Sustainable Development Goals. By 2030, the world is supposed to have achieved certain milestones. And one of them is the elimination of FGM. Well, we are nowhere near that now in Egypt. And one of the things I need to also mention here around FGM and around sexuality in general, it's like the elephant or camel in the room, if you like, which is COVID-19. All right. COVID-19, we haven't really started to come to grips what the implications are for sexuality and all the aspects of private life. But we are getting glimpses. And one of them is around, for example, child marriage, which has increased in many parts of our region, domestic violence, which has also increased. And also there are some anecdotal reports about FGM rates actually increasing during this period of COVID-19. So all this is to say, again, this is the one step forward, half a step back.
A fact that I find quite interesting in cultures with exacerbated virility is that homosexuality is crucial to gather men around the same ideal. We talk about bromance, but it can go as far as homophilia and the accomplishment of the sexual act itself. So basically, we smoke shishas without changing the cap. We kiss each other on the neck. We lean on each other's shoulders when we are standing. We take showers together after having played soccer. We hold hands in the streets. So is it just a cultural devoid of sexual attraction, or can we see an unfulfilled desire?
Well, I think it's all of the above. It does really depend on the individuals in question. But I don't think it's a surprise. And again, not unique to the Arab region, but in any society in which we have segregation of the sexes, I mean, ikhtilat, right? You are going to see strong levels of homosexuality. And this is also true of women as well. My relations with my female friends in the region are different than those outside. I mean, we hold hands, we send affectionate messages. It's just a much more intimate and connected way of engaging with one another. So it's women for women and men for men. Again, the issue has been that what we're lacking is that public display of affection between men and women. And it's only very recently, and it's really actually interestingly since the Arab Spring in Egypt, for example, that I have seen young men and women holding hands or arms draped over each other publicly. This was quite dramatic. So I don't think it's a surprise that you would see this natural desire of human beings for connection to then be reflected or be exercised where it is socially acceptable with people of our own sex. And yes, depending on the individual, it can cross over into sexual desire, or perhaps it doesn't. But what I think it does speak to is a certain degree. It's very interesting. There appears to be both more fluidity in what we deem acceptable, because when you see two men holding hands in the West, for instance, you see them as a romantic or sexual couple. And the reality in the Arab region is that could be anything. So it's interesting, isn't it? It's like a bit of a paradox. We have both more sexual flexibility or fluidity, but at the same time we have less. I think the concept of having a sexual identity or a sexual orientation as your identity, which again, some scholars have argued is a very Western construct, and really not traditional in the way we think about same-sex relations in the Arab region. My experience in working with, for example, LGBTQ NGOs that we have across the region, and the growing body of research on LGBTQ in the Arab world, what I would say is that there is still a spectrum. I have many friends many of whom are really fantastic activists working in the human rights space, who very clearly self-identify as gay or bi or lesbian or trans or queer, for instance. But I have also met many men, for instance, who, for example, will be having sex with other men, but do not think of themselves as gay. It's just not part of their identity. And I think one of the challenges here about sexual identity is that it is rather predicated on the notion of a personal identity, of personal rights. And it was really brought home to me by an activist in Lebanon who said to me, Shereen, how am I going to have a sexual identity in my community if I don't even have a personal identity? In the records of the Lebanese state, I am registered as the daughter of my father. And if I were to marry, I would be the wife of my husband. To have sexual rights, to have a sexual identity, I need to have an individual identity and individual rights. And this is getting back to what we were talking about earlier. This is, again, the appearance and the reality is connected to the individual and the collective. And the appearance is all about satisfying the collective need to conform. Well, it's very interesting, again, because if you go back in the history of our writings, so if you look back 1,000 years to this erotica, most of the chapters are related to women having sex with women or men having sex with men. It's very, very interesting. We have a long history of erotica, poetry, literature, you name it, talking about same-sex relations. And in fact, ironically, for most of our history in the West, we were famous for frankly having same-sex relations. It's really interesting. We were famous for being open about sexuality when the West was more closed, and now we're seen as being more closed about it when the West, or at least parts of the West, are more open. So it's a switching roles, switching position. What I would say in general, we have these laws across the region, most countries, which, in one way or another, criminalize same-sex relations. And in some cases, they're quite specific. They're about sodomy, all right? So this is about anal penetration. So in other places, they are more general about same-sex relations. So that's in Lebanon, for example. That's Article 534, acts against unnatural acts. Yeah. But what's interesting about that is that we have had pushback. We do have NGOs, civil society groups in our region, which have challenged that. And in Lebanon, for instance, Article 534, repealing that legislation is very tough in Lebanon, given the political context. But what they have done in Lebanon is very interesting. The judges have challenged it, or lawyers have taken cases, something called strategic litigation, in which you actually get judges to rule against the law. And this sets precedent. And in the Lebanese legal context, this means you get progress. Effectively, the law is on the books, but it's not exercised. It's not enforced. So it's what we say in Egypt, Madame Baïd Antizi Khalas. So long as it is away from me, it's okay. So basically, the general policy is that if you want to do it under the table, in private, is really not my business, okay? It's when you try to take it public, gay pride parades, for example, which they have had in the past in Beirut. And this is really important because this lies at the heart of how we get progress on sexual rights in our region. What we're fighting for in general is not the freedom, for example, for people to come out. Okay, what we're fighting for is the freedom for people to stay in and do what they want to do in the privacy of their own homes. What's really important about that privacy argument is that that is embedded in Islam. We are exhorted as Muslims not to spy on our neighbors, not to give false testimony. So that privacy element is really important because that then would hopefully give us what you're talking about, the liberation or frankly, the freedom to do as we choose, however we want to interpret it, in the privacy of our own homes.
That is an excellent transition to my last question, which is sex the most intimate thing and yet a very political thing? What do you think is needed for Arab and or Muslim people to make their own sexual revolution wherever they are in the world?
I believe this change is happening now. And I see it every day in the lawyers I speak with, in the doctors I engage with, in the bloggers and the film directors and the journalists who are challenging the received wisdoms of conservative voices that tell us this is haram, you can't do it. And they're saying, well, no, show me the evidence, show me the proof. And they're pushing back. And they are making progress, small change on the ground. What I would say is essentially since the Arab Spring, there are these bubbles. There are these bubbles of NGOs that are doing fantastic work, let's say, on trying to change the discourse to open up the space around abortion, for instance, or LGBTQ rights, or, for example, comprehensive sexuality education in schools, or the rights of unmarried mothers. And they're happening everywhere in our region. And these bubbles are getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and more people are inside the bubble. But it's still a bubble, and it only takes one prick for it to all collapse. And that's the problem. We're getting change, but it's quite fragile. And how do we embed it? I think the key to that is also linking up with the politics, because we're not, by and large, living in democracies in our region. We're living in autocratic states. And so if you want to get the change to stick, it has to happen from the ground. It can't come from the top down. I can tell you, for example, in Egypt, going back to FGM, we've had laws on the books for many, many years on FGM criminalizing the practice. And yet there have been only a handful of prosecutions. So it's not enough for the state to say, we want this to happen. It has to come both from the ground. You have to get the change at the ground level. And then it needs to connect to somehow the politics, that the political powers don't see it as a threat and frankly see it in their interest to make change. And when those two meet in the middle, that's when we can get lasting shifts in our region.
So we'll wrap this up. But first, in each episode of JINS, we will deconstruct together a myth or a lie that I've been told or that I have often heard of. A friend's mother, a middle-class white French woman in her 50s, said to me, "No, but in those countries it's normal for them to be illiterate, poor, etc. But here in France, there are no longer any problems for Muslim women. They are better off here." What would you have answered to that?
Well, to begin with, we have higher rates of female secondary and university education in the Arab region than in many other countries around the world, including in some Western countries. And in fact, in some parts of our region, we have more women going to university than men. I think it's really important to challenge this, as I said, this impression that Arab women are hopeless and helpless. We're not, by and large. And those of us who are fortunate enough to be able to maneuver in our lives are also trying, in many cases, to help other women do the same. So I think we need to challenge that. And very often, in my own family, for instance, my grandmother used to rule she was the ruler of the house, but she always made it look like it was my grandfather who was making the decisions and calling the shots. And I think that women in the Arab region know how to maneuver. Many, many women know how to get what they want. They just need to make it look a little bit different than we do in the West. As for Muslim women living in the West, I can't speak to the French experience. I grew up in Canada. But what I can say is that the idea that the West is some sort of sexual paradise and we've got everything, figured out here is, I think, mistaken. And I have 3 words for you to illustrate that. It's #MeToo. The idea that sexual violence is only something that happens in other places and not in the advanced West has been shown to be fallacious, as the debates over the past few years have seen. So I think it's very important that no matter where you sit in the world, you see yourself on a spectrum of sexual function, basically. We all have hangups. We all have problems. Every society has challenges. We're just at different places at different times, but we're all on the same spectrum. And we are all at one level or another struggling. towards the achievement of sexual rights in our lives.
Thank you so much, Shereen. I feel like I'm empowered to change the word now.
You and our listeners, I hope, too.
Thanks a lot to all listeners. You'll find all the aforesaid references in the description below, as I did every single time during season 1. For the most curious minds among you, I'll put a few book and film recommendations linked to today's topic. For those who don't know, JINS means sex in Arabic. It can also mean gender or sexuality. It has also the same roots as the word for nationality. So yeah, JINS is all about identity. Be it on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, Google Podcasts, Deezer, or else. Don't forget to subscribe to JINS Podcast account and to leave your questions and comments. Go subscribe to JINS Podcast on Instagram at JINS_podcast. Don't hesitate to share around every time you listen to an episode, because you should always remember that someone, somewhere, somewhat needs a new light shed on Islam, gender identity, sexualities, Arab origins, or anything that can be prone to oppression. So please do your part and pass the word around. See you soon on JINS.